Thank you all very much for coming along this evening. For those who don't know, my name's Jonathan Mickey. I'm the president of Kellogg College, but my greatest claim to fame is that my father was Donald Mickey, who was the youngest codebreaker at Bletchley Park, who knew and worked with Sir Dermot Turing's uncle, Alan Turing. And so my role this evening is to introduce our speaker, but first ask everyone to switch their mobile phones off. Secondly, say we're not planning a fire practice, so if the alarm goes off, we need to leave the building. And thirdly, we are filming this for our students who live and work all around the world, so they can join in. So if anyone doesn't want to be filmed, please let a member of staff know. I suppose given the subject matter, it's possible that one or two spies have come along to take some and wouldn't want to be filmed. So if you're one of them, just let us know and we'll know who you are. So Dermot Turing is a polymath. He did his doctorate in Oxford in genetics, but then spent most of his career in the legal profession, as well as being a trustee of Bletchley Park and writing several books on his uncle Alan Turing, on the history of computing and code breaking. And his latest book, just published, is on the breaking of the Enigma code, and he's kindly agreed to sign copies afterwards. And we also have the book from Bletchley Park on the exhibitions they have around the Enigma machine. So I'd encourage you all to buy your Christmas presents early, as I will be doing, and get signed copies for all your friends and relatives. So with that, Dermot, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Right, okay. Audible, I hope. Thank you very much for coming. Very nice to be back in Oxford. And it's particularly nice to be in Oxford because this is the kind of audience where I know I can rattle through stuff at 90 miles an hour and I won't leave you behind. So that's great stuff. So I'm going to begin, as I always do, by showing you a picture of Alan Turing at the Enigma machine. That's what he spent the whole of World War II doing, as we know. In fact, I've got another whole presentation about whether Alan Turing actually saw an Enigma machine at Bletchley Park, and I think Andrew Hodges will correct me on this. I think the answer is probably yes, and probably about 1942. But so this is tosh. So what we'll do now is do the real story about Enigma code breaking and how it was by more or less a fluke that Bletchley Park actually managed to have any success on Enigma code breaking during World War II at all. And you may think that sounds really weird. So we'll begin with the state of knowledge as it was in roughly early 1939. This paper, which comes from the National Archives, was written by the man who has the claim to be Britain's greatest cryptographer of all time. That's a person called John Tiltman, who's very few people have heard of him. This guy spent most of the 20th century breaking codes of unbelievable difficulty, including the Lorentz machine, which was the teleprinter machine that was being used for the top level messages in World War II sent by the Germans. And then when he retired from GCHQ at the age of 65, he was so valuable that the Americans snapped him up and he worked for the next 20 years at the NSA, which is sort of like remarkable. You're taking on somebody who doesn't retire until they're 85. So John Tiltman knew a thing or two about code breaking. And what he says here about the Enigma machine, he says, in 1931 we were provided by the French with some photographs and directions for use of the German Army Enigma cipher machine. I'll tell you a little bit more about those documents in a moment. The photographs show an attachment on the front of the machine, which does not appear on the model available to the public. the directions given do not fully explain the function of this attachment, which is still not understood here. Okay, so let's go back to the Enigma machine. You can't quite see it, but under Benedict Cumberbatch's hands, there's the plug board on the front of the thing. Yeah, you've seen the Enigma machine? You vaguely remember what I'm talking about. The commercial model that you could go and buy in Woolworths did not have that thing on it. And that's the state of knowledge that the Brits were in 1938 when Tiltman wrote this paper, and that continued into the spring of and early summer of 1939. It wasn't just they didn't know what this plug board thing on the front was. They didn't know the wirings in the machine. So they didn't know the wirings in the famous 3 rotors in the Enigma machine, and they didn't know how the keyboard was connected up to the entry plate where the electric current enters the bank of 3 rotors. And if you think about this, the mathematicians of you will have got there already, but there are 26 factorial different ways of wiring up that keyboard to that entry plate. So how are they going to figure this out? So this was a state of ignorance just about the time Munich crisis, Anschluss, the point where Hitler tore up the Munich agreement and decided to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia, and, importantly for the Poles, a chunk of Lithuania that was north of Poland. There is no way, without knowing the wiring of the Enigma machine, you're ever going to decipher a single encrypted Enigma message. This just seems like incredible then, because, spoiler alert, Alan Turing's design for the bomb machine that would tell the British how the Germans would set up their Enigma machines was designed and in the hands of the engineers by the late autumn of 1939. So we've gone from 0 to solution in what, in technological terms, is like no time. How? That's the question. So we'll start the story in the black and white era. I would like to introduce you first of all to my friend Hans Thilo Schmidt, described as the greatest spy of World War II. Well, by World War II he wasn't really doing much spying, but this is a decorated Iron Cross wearing veteran from the trenches of World War I, a German veteran, as you will detect. After World War I, Hans Thilo Schmidt found himself at a bit of a loose end. You remember the ghastly period of German history where they went through hyperinflation and all that kind of stuff. Even decorated war heroes like Hans Thilo Schmidt didn't have anything useful to do. Most importantly, he didn't really have a sensible way to fund his lifestyle, and his lifestyle required him to, well, sort of begin at the beginning. I mean, we're talking about nice suits would be a good thing, nice things to drink like champagne would be a good thing, champagne and brandy preferably, nice cigars would be better still, and lots of nice girlfriends. I mean, that would be a very, very good thing indeed. None of these things are purchasable on the civil servant salary that he had, but he had connection. His brother was still in the German army in the officer corps, and he'd survived the culling of the German army that took place in 1919, and he found himself in the Cipher Bureau. So he got his brother a job there. So Hans Thilo Schmidt finds himself with access to the safe in which the secret documents are kept. And Hans Thilo Schmidt, who is no fool, realises that if he sells these things to the French, he could make himself lots of money, and then he could buy the clothes and the champagne and the girlfriends and all the rest of it. So that's what he does. He walks into the French embassy one day, and I'd now like to introduce you to the scary character in the middle. This is Rudolf Lemoine, also known as Rudolf Stallman, also known as the Baron von Koenig, also known as Rex, which was his cover name given by French intelligence. Rex is the one who checks out the walk-ins to see whether they are the real deal. So Rex is also a master at selling forged documents from one country to another, so he's slightly suspicious about these code books that Schmidt says he might have access to. And so he calls in the Cipher Bureau, French Cipher Bureau's expert, who is the guy on the right. This is Gustave Bertrand. He's a captain in military intelligence in the French army. And Bertrand looks at this stuff that Lemoine or Rex or Stallman or whatever we're going to call the guy in the middle comes up with and says, I think this might be the real deal. So they arrange a meeting. Because they're all spies, all three of them, they need to meet in a hotel in a secret location, which I will tell you is the Grand Hotel in the town of Verviers in Belgium. Schmidt gets out of his briefcase the documents that he has lifted from the safe in his brother's office. Bertrand, who's the most junior of the three of them, goes up to the bathroom of his hotel room suite. And the reason he goes to the bathroom is because he's going to take photographs of these documents, and the bathroom is the only room which doesn't have any natural light in it, so it's good for taking pictures. So Bertrand, who's banished to the bathroom, is taking pictures of whatever Schmidt has got. The other two are sitting in the bar and they're drinking champagne and brandy and smoking cigars, which is, of course, what you do. Oh, and also Rex is handing Hans Thilo Schmidt a cheque for 5,000 Reichsmarks, which is about a year's salary. Okay, now there's a personal story coming in here. This thing here, you will probably recognise what it is. It's the thing that John Tiltman doesn't know what this device on the front of it does yet. This photograph is a photograph of the picture that Bertrand took in the bathroom in this hotel room in Verviers in 1932. No, 31 I think. It's probably just around late 31. And this is personal to me because Bertrand's archives were released by the French equivalent of MI6, the DGSE. They were released to the public rather less than 3 years ago. I was one of the first people to be allowed to go and look at these documents. So I'm sifting through these files, and we're talking about archivists like to talk about documents in terms of linear feet. So there's about 1 linear metre of documents. So you imagine them all. There's a lot of paper. Somewhere in there are these glossy photographs taken by Bertrand of what he was shown in 1931 in this hotel room. And I'm sitting there with my camera going, oh wow, I've seen the picture that puzzled John Tiltman that he wrote that memo about. What is this attachment on the front of the thing? The documents don't explain this fully. So what we've got here is we've got a transfer to French intelligence of the operating instructions for the Enigma machine. What we haven't got is the missing information that John Tiltman wants, which is the wirings. Without the wiring information, the photographs of the machine and the operating instructions are useless. Bertrand, as we know, sends the stuff over to the Brits to see what they can make of it, and the answer is they can't. He, of course, talks to his own colleagues in French intelligence to see what they can make of it. The answer is, without the wirings, this is hopeless. And he's got a third card up his sleeve, which is that he's just been instructed by his boss earlier that year to reach out to the Poles. And the Poles, ever since World War I, the Poles and the French have had an intelligence cooperation piece to their military mutual support treaty. And so he reaches out to the colonel who's in charge of the Polish Cipher Bureau to see if the Poles might be interested. And he gets on the train and he goes all the way across Germany, goes to Warsaw to meet Colonel Langer. And Langer, unlike the French and unlike the British codebreaker, says, wow, this is amazing stuff. Of course we could do something with this. This is fantastic. Thank you so much. More, please. Various things come out of this. One is that Bertrand and Rex keep up the liaison with Hans Thilo Schmidt, who until well into the early part of 1940 and possibly beyond, continue to receive a steady flow of intelligence from Hans Thilo Schmidt. Hans Thilo Schmidt moves around the German civil service a bit and ends up in various secret positions, and where he's very closely connected to very high-level strategic thinking of the Germans. So he's a classic spy. He's feeding this information in a true John le Carré tradecraft manner back to the French. I mean, it's absolutely quite the most extraordinary story. And he's also feeding code books and all the other good stuff as well. So this relationship is very, very fruitful. Costs the French a lot of money. Hans Tilo Schmidt buys himself some very expensive clothes and some really quite attractive girlfriends as well. Okay. Back to the technical side of things. Langer and his number two, Maximilian Chansky, rope in one of the mathematics graduates that the Polish Cipher Bureau has hired at the end of the 1920s, and notably this guy who's Marion Rejewski. They stick Marion Rejewski into a windowless room. There's something about windowlessness and code breaking which is a bit weird, but they stick Marion Rejewski into a windowless room and they give him the photographs, the operating instructions, they give him some enciphered Enigma messages, and they give him the benefits of his education. And he's been doing group theory, and in particular he's been doing permutation theory at the University of Poznan, and he remembers his lectures. Now, permutations are a real pain because you can't manipulate them like normal algebra. You know, if you multiply by 2 and then you divide by 2, you should end up with what you started with. Permutations don't work like that. If you add them together and then you take away the one that you added, you don't end up with what you started with. It doesn't work that way. Permutations are a real pain to manipulate. But Rejewski knew how to do it. So Rejewski sat down and he worked out that each of these rotors was creating permutation. The wiring from the keyboards to the entry plate was creating a permutation. It gives these all algebraic symbols, and then he works it all out. And I'm not going to take you through that page because it's written in 2 languages I don't speak. One of them is permutation theory and the other one is Polish. So we will move swiftly on to his conclusions, which is that basically he was able to deduce mathematically, I think it's an astonishing code-breaking achievement, he was able to deduce mathematically what the wiring was. In other words, to solve the permutation on 2 of the 3 rotors, and he guessed at the connection wiring between the keyboard and the entry plate. And the way he's got 26 factorial, that's a huge number. 26 factorial guesses that he could make. On the commercial machine, it was all very simple because Q was wired to Q, W was wired to W, E was wired to E, R was wired to R, etc., etc., etc. He knew that that was not the military model. They had changed that. So which of the other 26 factorial options had they chosen? And he said, well, they're Germans. It's obvious. Q will be wired to A, W will be wired to B, E will be wired to C, R will be wired to D. And that's what it was. Guessed it right, first time. So he'd got another one of the permutations out, and with that he'd got enough answers. You know, he's got how many equations in how many variables. He's got enough of his variables sorted to be able to find out the rest of them. So he'd actually, by pure mathematical analysis, reverse engineered the German military Enigma machine in 1932. 1932. Not, I'm sorry to say this, makers of the Imitation Game movie, 1942, 1932. Okay, this is all fine. So we've now got the possibility of going off to the Polish engineering workshops and making fake Enigma machines, or perhaps what we might call reproduction Enigma machines, which aren't quite Enigma machines, but they've got the same wiring, same functionality, so they can make them. But that doesn't enable them to break the Enigma messages yet, because every day the Germans are going to set their machine up in some unknown way. They've got, which rotors have they chosen? Which order are the rotors in the machine? How have they turned the rotors to the beginning point of the message? What plugins are they using on the plug board? All those things are unknown still. So what you need to know is how, if you are a German code cipher clerk, how you are going to set up your machine. So the way that Rejewski and his colleagues found their way to the answer to how they set up their machine is to study the German practice. Now, you think about this. If I want to send to Professor Andrew Martin an encoded Enigma message, if his machine is set up a different way from mine, he's going to get gobbledygook out when he puts the intercepted message into the received message into his machine. So he's got to set his machine up the same way. Now, we can't broadcast that information about how to set up your machine, because then the wretched Brits will get it and they'll set up their Enigma machines the same way, and then it's not a secret anymore. So we've got to figure out a way of doing this. So first of all, what the Germans did was they did provide people with setup sheets. So they told them which rotors to use on a particular day, and they told them which cross plugins to use on a particular day, and they told them which order to put the rotors in the machine. But that still leaves the question about the orientation of the rotors for the beginning of the encryption process. There's 26 times 26 times 26, 17,576 different ways you can orientate those three rotors. Key piece of missing information. And that's variable for each message. So I need to tell Andrew how to set the three rotors in his machine so that his decryption starts at the same place as my encryption. Yeah, we're all so far. I've got more smiles than frowns, so I think I'm doing okay. So this is what we've got to do. Each message has got its own start position, which needs to be communicated secretly. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose a random position for my three rotors, and then I am going to work out in my head the start position for the actual message. So I've got two randomly chosen sets of three letters. One for the secret setup information, one for the message itself. And then what the Germans did, and this is where Rejewski found his way in, is that they used the first set of three random letters to encrypt, using the Enigma machine, the secret information about how the real message was going to be encrypted. So the three starting position sequence for the real message. So okay, so if I chose for the real message the letters RTZ, and you can tell I'm not a very bright German because that's exactly, you'll find that on your keyboard, it's on the top row, RTZ, and then I will send that information to Andrew by encrypting it using the start position QWE, because I'm not a very bright German and I'm just picking the letters off the keyboard. So using QWE I send RTZ, and then I send RTZ a second time, and that was the Achilles heel in the German procedure before May 1940. Because by transmitting it twice, it gives rise to the possibility of a thing called a female. That's not very politically correct, is it? Okay, so a female is where, so if you just think about what's actually been transmitted through the ether. First of all, I've told Andrew to put his Enigma rotors to QWE so that he could actually then decipher the actual message setting, and that's been sent twice. But what the beginning of each message looks like is a sequence of 9 letters. One is how to set up the machine which is broadcast to the world to do the decipherment of the actual message start position, and then the message start position twice over. And then you get funny patterns sometimes appear, and these are the females, which is where a letter appears twice in the same position. So you can see in these ones I've highlighted in yellow that there are some letters that appear twice. So this is where the secret start position has been enciphered twice, and then just by a process of coincidence, 3 places on, that letter I've pressed on my Enigma keyboard has come out as the same thing 3 places later. Interesting. And these are what were called females. Why are they called females? They were called females because the Polish word for the same is similar in Polish to the word for female, so it's Samicka and Samicki or something, and so they called them females in Polish, and when the Brits got hold of the technique, they just translated it literally. So then they started, and there are all sorts of stupid stories about this, they started having machines to find females, which of course the Brits then called sex machines. You know, I mean, never mind, it's too embarrassing. Okay. Rejewski and his colleagues exploited the idea that females told you something about what it did is when you found females, they allow you to eliminate vast numbers of those 17,576 possible setups for the three wheels. They can only occur in not completely rare situations, but they're much less probable. So once you've actually spotted a female, it gives you a pretty good idea as to what the three rotor positions are likely to be. And if you can find, for a particular day with lots of messages going out and people are setting up their machines differently for each message, you can find several females for different starting groups, then you can start testing them for consistency. So this machine, which is the Polish bomber, probably not invented by Rejewski, I think probably invented by Jerzy Rejewski with a Polish engineer called Antony Palot. You can see that on the top of it you've got these cylindrical things. They're actually rotors. Although they don't look like Enigma rotors, they're doing the same job. They've got rotor type wiring in them, and they're changing one letter to another, and they rotate, which is what this cogwheel type of thing you can see is. And then these switches on the front tell the operator, or tell the machine, the operator tells the machine what the input current going into each of these banks of three rotors is going to be. And what they're doing is they're testing to see whether there is a particular rotor starting position, one of those 17,576 options, which would lead to the pattern of females that we have actually observed in that day's messages. And now, when the machine stops and it says, yes, this is a possible option, we think what we've done is found the correct combination of rotors, the order of the rotors in the machine, and a plausible start position for these messages that will enable us to figure out how basically that all the Germans using the Enigma machine on that day in that configuration have set things up. And that was great. And they didn't need to worry about the plug board, because in those days the Germans were only using 6 cross pluggings, which meant that when you actually translated German with some letters transposed, you can actually work out which letters have been transposed. So it's not that hard to use normal decryption techniques, normal code breaking techniques to figure out which letters have been transposed. So they actually found this quite good. This technique worked right up until December of 1938. December 1938 was quite important because at that point the Germans added 2 new rotors to their library of rotors. So at that point they'd only had 3. So there's only how many ways of putting 3 rotors into a machine? It's 6, isn't it? Yeah, it's 3 and then 2 and then 1. There's only 3 ways you can do it. When you've got 5 rotors to choose and you're choosing 3, you've got 60 different combinations. They needed 1 bomber for each combination, and the Poles had 6 because they'd been working with only 3 rotors. Suddenly, after December 1938, they needed 10 times as many machines, and they didn't have the engineering capacity to do it. Something important happens at almost exactly the same time. In late 1938, the British woke up to the idea that there might be a thing called World War II. They woke up to the idea that German aggression was not something that was going to be dealt with by a thin man waving an umbrella. And they began seriously, for the first time, talking to the French in particular, and with a certain degree of reluctance, the Poles, about intelligence cooperation. January 1939, the French had persuaded the Brits that it would be a good idea to go and have a conversation which took the form of a three-country conference where the codebreakers from Poland, Britain and France would all get together in a room and share know-how. Pretty challenging thing. The Poles had not divulged to Bertrand since 1932 that they had made any progress on Enigma whatsoever. The French had made no progress, and we know where John Tiltman was on this whole problem. So they had this conference, and really this conference got absolutely nowhere. Nobody shared anything of any real moment with the other two. But what was... It's very interesting. There's a reason why people go to meetings. And this meeting was very significant because people got to size each other up. They got to take each other's measure from an intellectual and from a security perspective. And so apart from that sort of piece of soft, we think we might be able to work with these guys kind of feeling that came out of it, two concrete things happened. One is that the French decided to formalise this triangular relationship, which is what this document is all about. For greater convenience and discretion, we propose from now on to use the following abbreviations. X is Paris, Y is London, and Z is Warsaw. And then he says, please number your documents so that we can help our filing clerks. This is formalising this triangular relationship using these code letters. The other thing that they agreed to do at the end of this conference was that if anybody made any progress on the Enigma problem, then they would send the others a message saying something has come up. Il y a de nouveau, something new. Now, of course, the Poles know the answers to all the questions that the Brits and the French have been asking at this conference. They've known these answers for 7 years. So they're keeping very quiet in this conference. But when they were recognised after a couple of months of tackling this problem of having 5 rotors to deal with instead of 3, and a change of German procedure that happened simultaneously in December 1938, and they're faced with what Hitler did in March 1939, which was the tear-up of the Munich Agreement, it suddenly dawned on them that, frankly, they're getting nowhere on this. There's no way they're going to be able to increase their engineering capacity in time. And what's more, the Germans might change this double encipherment of the message setting, this thing that gives Rejewski his way and the thing that makes the bombs actually work. They might change that. And they have a change of heart, and they decide that if they really want to get the French to take the military alliance seriously, if they want the British to put some oomph behind Chamberlain's guarantee, what they need to do is to show some commitment on their side. So what they do is they send a Il y a du nouveau message in early July 1939. July 1939. Bertrand gets back on the train, goes to Warsaw. Alistair Denniston and Dilly Knox, who probably is Britain's greatest codebreaker of the 20th century. Alistair Denniston is the head of the Government Code and Cipher School. He's been the chair of the January 3-country conference. Knox has attended it and nearly caused a diplomatic incident by losing his temper, but that's another story altogether, but never mind. So they specifically asked to have Knox, despite his bad temper, at this Warsaw conference, which takes place in the 3rd week of July 1939. When did World War II begin? We're seriously, scarily close to the point where the Germans invaded Poland. Over 2 days, the Poles told the French and the British everything. Everything that they had so carefully concealed in January. They told them everything. This is interesting because the Poles spoke, most of the Poles were bilingual Polish, German speakers because when they were kids they'd lived in the part of Poland that was occupied by the Germans, and so they spoke Polish at home and German at school. So the Poles spoke fluent German and a bit of French. The French spoke really no Polish, and schoolboy English and fluent German. The Brits spoke tolerably good English, no Polish whatever, good French, and because they were the Germans code-breaking squad, they spoke good enough German. So this three-country conference is conducted in German. The three countries conspiring against the Germans are speaking German. I like that. Denniston comes back from this three-country conference with this piece of paper, which is in the National Archives. As you can see, it's in German. And this is the list of bounty which the Poles have shared. And I've highlighted this particular one, Die Bomben. The Poles have told the Brits how to break Enigma using mechanical techniques such as the Polish bomber. Note that Alan Turing is not of this particular party, but Knox, who's in 6 weeks' time will become his boss on the Enigma code-breaking team at Bletchley Park. Knox is there, and Knox gets it. Knox is not a mechanically minded person. He's not a mathematician by training. He needs some technical support to be able to implement in Britain the ideas that he's just learned about in Warsaw. But this is very significant. They not only told the Brits and the French about bombers and how they worked, they supplied them with, we think anyway, we supplied them with drawings, diagrams, and possibly even a model, though I think that's perhaps more questionable. None of this material, if it was supplied, has survived, or if it has survived, it's survived at GCHQ and it's still a state secret. So anybody here from GCHQ would like to comment on that later, we'd be very pleased to hear your point. Now, my favourite photograph of World War II, the man in the car, doesn't really need any introduction. What he's doing here is he's reviewing his troops after the successful conquest of Poland. This is early October 1939. And why am I showing you a picture of Hitler doing the thing that Hitler does? This guy has got absolutely no idea that in that building, Marion Rejewski broke his code. I love it. It's a great picture. He looks so complacent. Right. Okay, so this is how we can equip Benedict Cumberbatch and his mate Gordon Welshman with the intellectual basis for the British bomb. Why is it called the bomb? It's called the bomb because it was named after the bomber. And don't ask me why the Poles called it. Well, you can, when we get to the Q&A, you can ask me why the Poles called the thing the bomber, and we can have a long conversation about that, and we won't be any the wiser, but never mind. So, the British bomb, the reason that Alan Turing's design could get into the hands of the engineers by November 1939 so quickly after that state of almost total ignorance about the Enigma machine is entirely because of that Warsaw conference and all that know-how that's handed over. Let's just spend 1 minute looking at this thing, because it doesn't look like the bomber, but if you think about it as looking at a bomber from the top as opposed to from the side, maybe it's got some similarities. What are these rows of three things if they're not mimicking the behaviour of three rotors in Enigma machines? That's exactly what they are. These are basically fake Enigma rotors. And they're wired up round the back to test for consistency. Is there a single starting position where lots of banks of rotors could all have derived from the same starting position? That's very similar to the kind of thing that the bomber was doing in testing for females. What this thing is doing, though, is it's not depending on that doubly enciphered starting sequence. What it's doing is it's guessing at the plain text of a message. So German military messages. If you are a German cipher clerk, which words will you never fail to put in your message? There are 2 words which all good Germans will put in their message, and what are those? Come on, we'll have a... Oh, well, we can't do this, we might get... never mind. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. The German greeting. You might look for the thing called the German greeting. But more prosaically, you might find that there are things in secret messages that say, this is a message for the commanding general. Or it might be that there are things like numbers in the message. So this is message number 37, part 2. Where are the numbers on an Enigma keyboard? Have to spell them out. E-I-N-S, Z-W-E-I, D, or actually they typically didn't, they did Z-W-O because Z-W-E-I and D-R-E-I can get confused, so they did Z-W-O, but never mind. So, you know, so message number 238, it's 200, you know, 38, that has to be spelt out. Unbelievable. So lots of guessable stuff. It gets worse. Weather ships stationed in the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean, right up north of Iceland, sending weather forecast information, which is vital for the campaigns going on in continental Europe, are sending helpfully entitled messages that begin Wetter Vorhersage, weather forecast. I'm going to use this bunch of fake Enigma machines to see if there is a given message setting that could turn W into X, which is what I observed, E into Q, which is what I observed, T into R, which is what I observed, T into S, which is what I observed, what have I got to, Veta, E into Z, which is what I observed, and so forth. You get the general idea. It's pretty similar to the thing that the bomber was doing, except it's using a thing called a crib, which is the guessed at plaintext, to see whether it is possible to find a starting position that will deliver the observed ciphertext from the guessed at plaintext. I'll let you into a secret of World War II. Benedict Cumberbatch's model, as delivered into the hands of the engineers in November 1939, didn't work so well. In fact, the problem was that it worked too well. This machine stops whenever it thinks it's found a plausible setting, and these 3 dials on the end tell you what the suggested answer is. There's also more information about the plug board, which is around the back. You can find all about that in the little blue book. But the point is that it stops every time it thinks it's got you a plausible answer. Alan Turing's machine stops too often. It stopped dozens of times for every test, and that was too many for the codebreakers to be able to check the stops efficiently. Gordon Welshman's modification of the machine turned it into something that would typically stop not more than 3 times for each test, and ideally once or twice. And that's manageable in terms of getting your 17,576 down to something you can actually cope with. Okay, so I've now finished the story of the evolution of Enigma, but I haven't finished my talk. You might wonder, because I wondered, and that's why I wrote a book about it, about these Polish guys and what became of them. There's a myth out there. There's lots of myths about Bletchley Park. One of the enduring myths about Bletchley Park is that the uncaring Brits, we get this a lot, particularly with Alan Turing, the uncaring Brits. They're good at this, the Brits being uncaring. The uncaring Brits spurned the codebreakers, so we don't want these foreigners messing up our nice show at Bletchley Park. It is not true. Shame, really. Myths, we like myths. But anyway, no, this one's not true. So Denniston, as soon as World War II broke out, Denniston's straight trying to find what's happened to the Polish codebreakers, and he's got permission from the Treasury to hire these guys, and the search is on, and they turn up in France. There's a whole story of sort of human woe and saga about how the Polish codebreakers escaped from Poland ahead of the German and then the Russian army, and how they managed to find their way to France. And they were rescued by Gustave Bertrand because they found themselves in the French embassy in Budapest and uttered the magical name of Gustave Bertrand, and the guys in the French embassy in Budapest never heard of him, put a call through to Paris, and they said, yeah, these guys are the real deal. So they ended up working for Gustave Bertrand in France. By the time Denniston has tracked them down, it's too late. Denniston says, well, can't you send them to Bletchley Park? It would be a really good thing for us to have them at Bletchley Park. And Gustave Bertrand said, but they're already working for French intelligence. You're too late, mate. So it's not true that we turned them away. There's a reason why people think that, though. And we'll come on to that in a second. There was a bit of a problem working for the French because the Germans invaded which countries in 1940? So the French codebreakers got chased out of their chateau just outside Paris, and they had to escape to North Africa, taking the Poles with them. Denniston has another go at this point, and the answer is you can't have the Polish codebreakers because they're still working for French intelligence. Gustave Bertrand's done this extraordinary triangulation where he's managed to get himself funded by the Vichy government, the one that we all think is slightly dodgy because we know it was hand in glove with the Germans. He's managed to get funded by the Vichy government to set up an intelligence service under the auspices of the Vichy regime, but which is actually still spying on the Germans, which is technically, because the Germans are still technically at war with the French, even after the armistice of 1940. It's the most incredibly complicated story. Gustave Bertrand goes and buys this place. There's a nice parallel with the story of Admiral Sinclair buying the premises of Bletchley Park so that he could secretly push his codebreakers into it. Gustave Bertrand buys a chateau in the south of France. If you're travelling in the Avignon region and you're doing all the sort of touristy things like going to the Pont du Gard and the Roman antiquities at Nîmes and all those kinds of things, this village called Uzès, it's about 15 minutes in the car from Nîmes. And you can still go to this place. I mean, it's a private house now, but there doesn't seem to be any security there, and nobody cared, and I went around and took lots of pictures. This picture was not taken by me. This picture was probably taken by Henryk Zygalski in about 1941, I should think. You can tell that one of the things the codebreakers was set to is pulling the creeper down off the building, and this one's got the creeper down, so that's interesting. Anyway, so they were in this building, and they were checking on the Germans, they were checking on the Russians, because don't forget Poland had been invaded by Russia as well as Germany in 1939, and yeah, they spent best part of 2 years in this place. They had some fun there as well, so they've got lots of pictures about codebreakers playing football and sort of, you know, getting up to crazy drinking bouts and all this kind of stuff. Until you get to late autumn of 1942, by which time the Brits and the Americans have decided they're going to invade French North Africa as part of the campaign of slowly recapturing Europe from German control. Precisely at that point, the Germans decide that they're going to take over the so-called free zone of the south of France, in which this chateau is located. So the codebreakers are on the run for the third time. They're having to try and escape from the Germans, and this time it's not hugely successful. I'm pleased to report that after some tribulations, Rejewski and Zygalski, and some of the others, made it to Britain. And this is where the myth of they were spurned by Bletchley Park comes in, because they weren't spurned by Bletchley Park. Nobody at Bletchley Park actually knew who they were at this time. Denniston's moved on, Knox is dead, Turing has moved on to do other things. So after 1942, Alan Turing wasn't doing any code breaking at Bletchley Park. So all the people who knew the Polish code breakers were not around anymore. But that's really not the point. The Polish code breakers were working for their bosses. By this stage, the Polish government is in exile in the UK. These people are part of the Polish military intelligence machine. They have to report to Polish military intelligence, who put them to work in this place just outside Hemel Hempstead, which is where they are being paid by the British to spy on the Russians, who were of course British allies at that time. And it's very convenient to have the code-breaking operation that's looking at the Soviets outside Bletchley Park. So Rejewski and Zygalski were retrained. They didn't speak Russian. They were retrained as part of the Russian team at this place, Felden, and they spent the rest of the war looking at Russian codes and ciphers. Where does this myth about them being spurned by Bletchley Park come in? Rejewski didn't like doing this. It's extremely dangerous, and there are all sorts of problems, particularly once the British government had de-recognised the Polish government in exile and recognised the Soviet created new Polish post-war government, communist government. Really, really dangerous for these guys to have been involved in this stuff. The idea of going back to Poland and being cross-examined by the communists about what they've been up to. Really terrible. Rejewski really didn't want to do this Russian stuff. And so Rejewski wrote this long memo saying, I really want to be put back onto the German stuff. I know that there's stuff going on at Bletchley Park. I'd really like to be involved in that. It's about time the Brits actually repaid their debt to us, and one way they could do that is to rehire me. But no, he's busy. He's doing this other stuff, and the Polish government won't let him go. So I'm not sure that Bletchley Park will get the blame for it. Okay, so we've heard about him. What about some of the others? Jerzy Rejewski, seen here with one of Henryk Zygalski's girlfriends. Jerzy Rejewski is probably, as I said, the designer of the bomber. He died in 1942. He's probably one of the brightest Polish mathematicians of the 20th century, and certainly one of the greatest code breakers. And he perished when this ship, the La Mauricière, foundered in very heavy seas. It was not torpedoed, it was just foundered. It was partly bad seamanship, partly bad weather, and partly just unfortunate. But so it foundered just off the Balearic Islands in January 1942. This photograph itself is quite interesting, because I've got another ship there. That's the Guédon, which was trying to rescue the people. Couldn't get any closer to the shipwreck because the seas were so high, it was extremely dangerous. You have to ask yourself, where was the photographer standing? You know, it's not in a helicopter. So there's a third ship on the scene from which the photograph was taken, and those who survived the shipwreck basically had to swim from one ship to the other in these high seas. So it's not really surprising that not a huge number of them made it. Rejewski was not one of them. There were all sorts of code-breaking stuff as well as people that perished in this shipwreck. So let's look at, this is Palut. He's the engineer behind the bomber. He died in Sachsenhausen in 1945, 3 weeks before the war ended, and the war in Europe ended. Because the Allies decided to bomb the Heinkel factory where the slave workers at Sachsenhausen, including him, had been housed. He's an interesting guy because he managed to win the confidence of the Germans in the Heinkel factory, got himself into a quality control position. No aeroplane wing would leave the Heinkel factory without being signed off by Palut as being safe for flying. Palut would not sign them off until he knew it was unsafe for flying. So. This is Fokczynski. He also died at Sachsenhausen, and I think this one died of starvation. He looks a bit resigned in this picture, and that's because I've had to crop the pictures down to fit them onto the slide. In this bit of the photograph is his friend Henryk Paszkowski, who was the sole codebreaker to survive this shipwreck, and so this is why we know the tale. He looks a bit resigned because he's holding Paszkowski's jacket, and I had to crop this bit out, not just because the slide doesn't have room for it, because it's kind of porn. It's like porn 1940s style. There's Paszkowski who's having a canoodle, shall we say, with his fiancée, and this is why Fokczynski is looking on saying, oh, not again. That's great. So I'll tell you, life in the south of France wasn't that bad. This is Langer, who all those years before, Bertrand got on the train to go and initiate the whole, I've got some photographs that you might be interested in exercise. Langer was a big, beefy, let's face it, he was sort of like, he ate too much. In the south of France, he was known as Monsieur Beaujolais because of his fondness for the local produce, and this is after he emerges from nearly 2 years in various forms of Nazi imprisonment. He's lost about half his body weight, and you just look at the facial expressions, and this is Chansky is number 2. This guy nearly died in this German captivity. So, and this is after they'd been they were liberated by the Americans in May 1945, and then they weren't repatriated to Poland. It was too dangerous for them to go to Poland, so they were sent to Scotland. So this is taken in, I think that picture's probably taken in Kinross. So they survived the war. That's Paszkowski. This is a non-pornographic photograph of him, so I can show this one to you. And his friend Kazimierz Gatza. Paszkowski and Gatza are interesting, not just because they're codebreakers who survived the war, but they went to work with Gustave Bertrand after the war, which is, I think, quite interesting. So these guys went and lived in France, and this guy married a French girl he'd met at the chateau in those days of the south of France. So it's all quite sweet, really. That's Rejewski. We know about Rejewski. Rejewski, he's the most unlikely person to qualify for a bravery award. He's a mathematician. He's really not in the least bit demonstrative. He's quite happy here, sitting reading a book. Obviously, he's really, really good at what he does. But and he's a nice enough guy. But he's only in the army on sufferance because that's what you had to. You had to have like some kind of army rank to be a codebreaker. He's the one guy out of the whole lot of them who, having been rescued and brought to Britain, he's the one guy who says, I am going to go back to Poland, even though I've been doing this anti-Soviet work. I am going to go back to Poland. That's where my wife and my kids are. It's where my responsibilities are. And he spent the next roughly 12 years being pursued to a greater or lesser extent by the Polish secret intelligence services, of course, in the Soviet puppets at this stage. But fortunately, by the time that Stalin died, Khrushchev takes over. There's a sort of slightly more liberal climate. He's doing a really boring accounting job. He's completely below the radar and saying, why have we got a file on this guy? Let's forget it. He wrote his memoirs in the mid-1960s. When a Polish historian came across those memoirs, stumbled upon them in the Polish military archives in the late 1960s, don't forget, Iron Curtain, Polish language. He writes a book about this, and he says the Poles broke the Enigma machine in the early 1930s. How many people on this side of the Iron Curtain found out about it? probably the square root of not very many. Eventually, the French found out about it. Bertrand wrote a memoir in the early 1970s, spilt the beans, and it's because Bertrand wrote his book in French that the Brits finally decided that they had to authorise the publication of a nice exercise in disinformation, which is called the Ultra Secret, by Group Captain Winterbottom, who knew very little about it but was reasonably close to the story. So this was quite helpful because Winterbottom managed to, he got the secret out there, got the Brits the credit for doing this amazing Enigma-y thing, and fogged up the whole detail of it, and including many of the myths come out of Winterbottom's book, including the one about the bombing of Coventry and all that kind of stuff. But had it not been for Rejewski's memoir in the Polish military archives, I don't know when this story would ever have come out. It's very interesting. It's a long sort of piece of evolution there. Doesn't he look like a 1960s film star? I mean, it's just fantastic. That's Henryk Zygalski. He's kind of, I haven't mentioned him very much, but he's very closely, intimately connected with the whole story. He invented his own Enigma settings finding techniques. He is kind of solidly there throughout the whole story. He's definitely one of the brightest of this bunch, and he's the life and soul of the party. He's got more girlfriends than Hans Thilo Schmidt. And the interesting thing about Zygalski is that he comes to Britain with Rejewski after having had all these adventures. They've escaped over the mountains, they've been chased by the Gestapo, God knows what else. I mean, all sorts of ghastly things have happened to them. Gets to Britain. And as well as continuing his secret life, he's sent to all sorts of places on secret missions, including Egypt at one point. He's done this Soviet code-breaking thing, and he's done the most extraordinary thing. He's fallen in love with a British girl. She's got a husband. That's not really very convenient. But the husband, this is just straight out of a love story. The husband conveniently dies, not in suspicious circumstances. The husband, who's an RAF officer, conveniently dies and leaves the way open for Rejewski to stay in Britain for the rest of his life. He becomes a maths lecturer at what's now the University of Surrey, and they all live happily ever after. It's fantastic. So that's a nice note to end on. I'm very happy to take questions, and I hope I haven't horribly overrun my allotted time span. But anyway.